Makoto was a professional model. Right after finishing a major fashion show, she was publicly scolded by her adoptive mother, Kimisawa. As the chief design director of Kimisawa Fashion, Kimisawa openly pointed out every mistake Makoto had made on the runway. She harshly criticized Makoto's professionalism and questioned her in a condescending manner without any regard for her dignity. Feeling completely defeated, Makoto took a taxi back to her apartment. The moment she stepped out of the car, she came face to face with the one man she never wanted to see again, her ex-boyfriend Akio. Before becoming a model, Makoto had been a troubled delinquent with a history of drug abuse. That dark past was enough to destroy her entire career, and Akio was the only person in the world who knew about it. This time, he had come to blackmail her. With a smug grin, Akio casually exposed every crime and mistake from her past before demanding 5 million yen in hush money. He even threatened that even if she paid him today, he would keep extorting her for the rest of her life. Makoto had spent years enduring her adoptive mother's constant criticism while also suffering endless blackmail from Akio. The pressure she had bottled up for so long finally pushed her past her limit. She grabbed a nearby vase and smashed it over Akio's head with all her strength. Akio collapsed to the floor instantly. Panic immediately overwhelmed Makoto's mind as she desperately weighed her options. On one side was the modeling career she had spent years building, the bright future that was finally within reach, and the chance to earn her adoptive mother's approval. On the other side was prison, the destruction of everything she had worked for, and a completely ruined life. In the end, driven by fear and selfishness, she chose to hide the murder and erase every trace of what had happened. Afterward, Makoto went to a department store and bought a large suitcase to dispose of the body, but just as she finished her purchase and was about to leave, she unexpectedly ran into her elementary school classmate Hajime. Makoto immediately became nervous because Hajime was a teenage detective famous for his brilliant mind. Without hesitation, she handed him 2 tickets to an upcoming modeling competition and invited him to attend. Then, claiming she had an urgent matter to take care of, she hurried away. But when Makoto returned to her apartment carrying the suitcase, an unbelievably horrifying sight greeted her. Akio, who had been lying motionless on the floor, suddenly opened his eyes. Even stranger, an exquisitely crafted French silver coin with an unusual pattern had mysteriously appeared on the floor. The next day, Hajime and Miyuki checked into the luxury resort hotel where the modeling competition was being held. The event was a decisive showdown between 2 giants of the fashion industry, and the outcome would determine who gained access to the industry's most prestigious resources. One side was Kimisawa Fashion, led by Kimisawa herself. The other side was Rokuju Fashion, founded by the rising designer Rokuju. The 2 fashion houses had been bitter rivals for years, and the competition was widely known as a battle that would decide the future of both brands. The relationships among everyone involved were incredibly complicated. Representing Kimisawa Fashion were company president Kimisawa, vice president Inukai, chief designer Naoko, assistant designer Sayoko, contract model Makoto, and employee Zenji. Representing Rokuju Fashion were President Rokuju and employee Suzuko. There was also the hotel's waiter Toru. After everyone was assigned their rooms, Makoto returned to hers and found an anonymous envelope waiting outside the door. Inside were photographs of Akio's death along with evidence showing Makoto disposing of the body. Suddenly, the room phone rang. The caller introduced himself as Burial Frank Case and used the murder evidence to blackmail Makoto, ordering her to kill someone. At the very same time, Inukai, the vice president of Kimisawa Fashion, received an anonymous package. Inside was a custom-made wedding dress with a French silver coin pinned to the center of its collar. Zenji explained that wedding dresses decorated with silver coins were actually burial garments worn by the dead and were considered an omen of death. Hearing this, Inukai immediately ordered Naoko to dispose of the dress. Meanwhile, the mysterious mastermind issued the first command: poison Naoko. With no other choice, Makoto secretly carried a poison capsule into the banquet hall and quietly emptied its contents into Naoko's glass of red wine. The banquet began, and everyone raised their glasses for a toast. But just before drinking, Naoko suddenly set her glass down and explained that she was allergic to wine. Acting like a gentleman, Rokuju picked up the glass and drank it for her. Moments later, the poison took effect, and he collapsed to the floor dead. Soon, Inspector Isamu arrived with a team of police officers. Hajime immediately realized that this had been a carefully planned murder. He then asked Naoko to put on the suspicious wedding dress. As expected, the dress fit her perfectly. After examining it, Zenji concluded that it was made with exceptional craftsmanship by a professional designer who knew Naoko's exact body measurements. It was obvious that Naoko had been the intended target. Kimisawa explained that the body measurements from the company's annual physical examinations were stored in the headquarters archives, where outsiders had no access. At that moment, Suzuko accused Naoko of intentionally giving the poisoned wine to Rokuju. However, hotel waiter Toru testified that Naoko had always been allergic to wine, meaning Rokuju drinking the poisoned glass was nothing more than a tragic accident. The next morning, Makoto carefully looked around the restaurant, trying to figure out the mysterious caller's true identity. At that moment, Hajime approached her, having already begun to suspect her. After poisoning the wine the previous night, Makoto had panicked and stopped Hajime from touching Naoko's glass. Under normal circumstances, Makoto's fingerprints should have been left on the glass, but now, only Naoko's fingerprints remained, while both Makoto's and Hajime's had mysteriously disappeared. Faced with Hajime's questioning, Makoto claimed that the real killer must have wiped the glass after poisoning it. Back in her room, Makoto was filled with regret. She regretted giving Hajime those modeling competition tickets, which had brought such a troublesome detective into her life. Just then, Burial's silver coin called again. This time, the mysterious mastermind ordered Makoto to kill Kimisawa Fashion's vice president, Inukai. He then explained exactly how the murder should be carried out. That evening, the hotel hosted a wedding-themed party. Everyone gathered inside the banquet hall. Not long afterward, a second anonymous package arrived. Inside was a custom-made men's tuxedo with a French silver coin pinned to the chest. Kimisawa immediately noticed that the tuxedo's measurements perfectly matched Inukai's build. The guests quickly searched the entire hotel. Before long, they discovered Inukai dead from poisoning inside an empty guest room. Police investigators examined the scene. 2 glasses of red wine sat on the table, each only half empty. Based on the evidence, they concluded that Inukai had been poisoned while sharing a drink with someone he knew. At the time of the murder, however, everyone had been attending the party. Every single person had an alibi, but Hajime had already seen through the trick. He later invited Makoto to his room and calmly explained that Inukai's murder was nothing more than a psychological illusion. The killer had prepared an empty room in advance. 2 wine glasses were placed on the table. One had already been poisoned, while the other was only half filled with wine. The entire setup was designed to create the illusion that 2 people had been drinking together. That false impression would naturally lead the police to eliminate everyone at the party from suspicion. Afterward, the killer contacted Inukai and invited him over for a drink. Once Inukai arrived, the killer made an excuse to leave temporarily, leaving him alone in the room. Without suspecting anything, Inukai simply picked up the wine glass and started drinking. Seconds later, the poison claimed his life. It was obvious that the murderer had to be someone Inukai trusted. Even after hearing Hajime's explanation, Makoto forced herself to remain calm and immediately raised an objection. Rokuju had died after drinking poisoned wine, so why would Inukai willingly drink from that glass? Hajime had expected exactly that question. He smiled and pointed out that the room they were standing in wasn't actually his room either. Makoto looked carefully and noticed that the name once written on the doorplate had completely disappeared. The killer had used a special type of paper whose writing vanished when exposed to moisture. At first, the killer wrote his own name on the door so Inukai would believe he had entered the correct room and lower his guard. Once the writing slowly faded away, the room became an unclaimed vacant room with no owner. That was the true heart of the entire trick. Even so, Hajime chose not to expose Makoto in front of everyone. He knew she had been abandoned by her mother as a child. He also knew her father had spent his days drunk, making her life miserable from the very beginning, and he understood that Makoto was nothing more than a pawn being manipulated by the mastermind. So in private, he urged her to turn herself in before it was too late. After returning to her room, Makoto couldn't calm the turmoil in her heart. Just then, Burial's silver coin called once again. The mysterious voice ordered her to carry out one final task. Following the instructions, Makoto pushed open someone's door, but the moment she stepped inside, a pair of hands suddenly appeared behind her. Soon afterward, a third anonymous package arrived. Inside was another Burial wedding dress together with a French silver coin. The dress was tailored perfectly for the assistant designer Sayoko. It was clear that Sayoko was the killer's next target. Meanwhile, Makoto woke up inside Sayoko's bedroom. A handgun was clutched tightly in her right hand. Beside her lay Sayoko's lifeless body. Makoto instantly realized that she had been framed. She hurried toward the window, desperate to escape, but the window would only open halfway. At that moment, Makoto caught the lingering scent of French perfume on her palm. It was the same perfume that only her adoptive mother, Kimisawa, always wore. She immediately became convinced that Kimisawa was the mastermind behind everything. Hearing the commotion, everyone rushed over, but the room was locked from the inside. Naoko quickly retrieved the spare key from the front desk. After unlocking the door, they found only Makoto and Sayoko lying lifeless on the floor. Sayoko was tightly clutching the room key in her hand, creating what appeared to be an impossible locked room murder. Everyone immediately assumed that Makoto was the killer. The moment Makoto saw Kimisawa, all of her hatred came rushing to the surface. She raised the gun and fired, striking Kimisawa in the abdomen. Kimisawa was rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. The police arrested Makoto on the spot and took her into custody for questioning. After repeated questioning from Hajime, Makoto confessed that she had killed Naoko and Inukai. She revealed that the mastermind was someone known as Burial Silver Coin, and that she had been nothing more than a puppet from beginning to end. After the interrogation, Isamu told Hajime that Sayoko's murder was an unsolvable locked room mystery. The door had been locked from the inside. The key was found in the victim's hand. The windows were sealed shut and impossible to enter through. Other than Makoto, no one else appeared to have had the opportunity to commit the crime. Every piece of evidence pointed directly at Makoto, making her the prime suspect in the series of murders. But Hajime refused to believe that Makoto had killed Sayoko. He was determined to uncover the real mastermind. The police then searched Makoto's room and found 3 floppy disks containing the physical data of every company employee. Those disks would become the key evidence needed to solve the entire case. As Hajime carefully reviewed every detail of the investigation, he happened to catch Toru smashing bottles of counterfeit wine with fake labels in the storage room. Toru admitted that the expensive wines sold by the hotel were actually cheap bottles with replacement labels. His words immediately gave Hajime a flash of inspiration, and he instantly saw through every trick used in the murders. He concluded that the killer would sneak into the hospital that night to silence the seriously injured Kimisawa. So Hajime prepared an ambush in advance. Late that night, a shadow quietly entered Kimisawa's hospital room. Just as the killer was about to strike, Isamu and Hajime suddenly appeared. Hajime immediately identified the true murderer, Kimisawa Fashion's chief designer, Naoko. He then revealed the complete truth behind the serial murders in front of everyone. First was Rokuju's murder. Naoko herself was severely allergic to wine. She relied on Rokuju's gentlemanly nature, knowing he would politely drink the poisoned wine in her place. Rokuju's death had never been an accident. It was a carefully planned murder from the very beginning. Second was Inukai's murder. Naoko remotely instructed Makoto to poison the wine, then used a fake nameplate to lower Inukai's guard and complete the murder. Third was Sayoko's locked room murder. Sayoko had been killed by Naoko herself, and the entire locked room scene was deliberately staged to frame Makoto. Before the murder, Naoko borrowed the spare key to Sayoko's room from the front desk. She then removed both key tags, attached the ordinary key from her own room to Sayoko's key tag, and returned it to the front desk. From that moment on, she could freely enter Sayoko's room, kill her, lock the door, and leave without attracting suspicion. Later, when Naoko retrieved the key with Sayoko's room tag from the front desk, she secretly switched it back to Sayoko's actual spare key on her way upstairs. She then unlocked the door in front of everyone. That was the complete trick behind the impossible locked room murder. But despite how flawless the plan seemed, it ultimately failed because of one tiny detail. When Hajime escorted Naoko back to her room earlier, she casually opened the door without using a key. That single action exposed the truth, because she never actually had a key. She simply never locked her own room. As for the final step of Naoko's plan, it was to frame Makoto. Naoko deliberately used Kimisawa's signature French perfume to drug Makoto, making her believe that Kimisawa was Burial Silver Coin. Consumed by rage, Makoto then shot Kimisawa. Even after Hajime laid out every detail, Naoko still refused to confess and demanded decisive evidence. Hajime immediately produced the 3 floppy disks containing the employees' body measurements and pointed out the biggest flaw in the entire case. Every victim had received a funeral dress personally tailored by Naoko, but creating perfectly fitted clothing required detailed measurements, including height, weight, and shoulder width. The 3 discs contained the physical data of all 3 victims, yet Naoko's own measurements were nowhere to be found. And yet, the very first wedding dress delivered fit Naoko perfectly. The only person capable of making a dress that matched her body so precisely was Naoko herself. At last, Naoko confessed and slowly revealed the secret she had carried for 9 long years. Her life had mirrored Makoto's in many ways. She had been abandoned by her biological mother as a child, and later blackmailed by her ex-boyfriend, 9 years earlier. After becoming the company's chief designer, her ex-boyfriend showed up demanding money. During the argument, she accidentally killed him. Kimisawa witnessed everything. Instead of calling the police, Kimisawa helped dispose of the body, cleaned up every trace, and comforted Naoko, telling her not to ruin her life over someone like him, starved of love her entire life. Naoko came to see Kimisawa as the mother who had saved her, and from that day forward, she devoted herself completely to her. But she never expected Kimisawa to reveal her secret to Inukai and even name him as the future heir of the Kimisawa brand. Feeling betrayed by the person she trusted most, Naoko was consumed by anger and resentment, which ultimately drove her to plan the entire series of murders. At that moment, Kimisawa slapped Naoko across the face and finally revealed the whole truth. Back when they disposed of the body together, Inukai had secretly witnessed everything. For years, he had used that secret to blackmail Kimisawa. To protect Naoko, Kimisawa pretended to give in and agreed to hand the Kimisawa brand over to Inukai, but in secret, she had already signed documents to abandon the company and planned to build a brand new fashion house for Naoko, giving her the chance to live a happier life. After learning the truth, Naoko was overwhelmed by regret and despair, and completely broke down. And with that, the case finally came to an end.